So, hello from Canada. It is so encouraging. I must tell you, this is the art of encouragement on display that we could bring together all of us around the world to talk at a time when the majority or all of us are experiencing the same social reality, I guess is what I would call it. So, tonight it truly is a celebration. And Eva, I was going to have everybody do a virtual hug, but I think you've already hugged once, but that doesn't stop us at ICASSI from hugging a lot because that's what we do. So here is the man that obviously we have chosen in our lives to follow in terms of his teachings and his psychology. I began my involvement in Adlerian psychology in 1973. And what was wonderful at that point is Heinz Ansbacher was one of my teachers. And of course, he knew Adler. And I always felt that what I learned through him was not just the theory, but also whom Alfred Adler truly was, because he and Rowena, I had spent many, many years with Alfred and Raisa, and of course, they translated our Bible, which is the individual psychology of Alfred Adler. So here he is in his high school time, and then his time, as Eva said, that he was in the army as a physician, and then much later in his life, I think this one is closer to the time he was in New York. So I thought it would be only fitting that we open the school really with the words of Adler. So I pulled together a number of quotes that speaks to how he saw the world and what his private logic was about the world, himself, and others. So life means to be interested in my fellow men, to be part of the whole, to contribute my share to the welfare of mankind. Human beings live in the realm of meanings. We experience reality always through the meaning we give it. And that's why we talk about the concept of biased apperception. Not in itself, but as something interpreted which enables us to meet reality insofar as it concerns mankind. Now, I want to point out the PowerPoint will be available for you to link to, or I think Sabina and I will figure out a way that you'll be able to download the PowerPoint so you don't have to worry about taking notes. So you can already see that he saw the world in relation to others and saw his world as an interpretation or a way of seeing himself, others, and the world that we now live in. He talked a lot about life is movement. And I remember Kurt Adler saying to me one day, because I also was able to learn from Kurt and Alexandra, and he said, well, my father, said that you don't listen so much to the words, you watch where the feet are pointed. And that's such an illustration of movement. In other words, we know in therapy, we know when working with our students and in presenting that people are always integrating and we're always in movement. We're in movement towards, we're in movement away, or we're just standing still. So these are his words. We are the picture and the architect of our lives. Or as I often say, we are the artist and the architect of our lives, creating pictures. And so I think it's so important to remember that what Adler modeled for us is, it is not what you think is happening. It is not how you're being presented, it is happening. You are the interpreter, you are the creator, you are the facilitator in basically your own life. Now, here was another quote of his that I thought was interesting. The only normal people are the ones you don't know very well. And I think that's very true in our work in education and therapy, because so often what people present to us is the way that they believe reality must be, should be, will be, and that they don't have options. And I think encouragement, which is one of our basic tenets, the courage for people to look at what decisions have I made about life and how am I understanding my own social embeddedness in life and how am I in relation with not only myself, my family, but my community and also the world. And I think that's where Adlerians shine, that we have a social conscience that is very strong and very developed in terms of feeling that what happens here in my country has to be considered in terms of its impact on your country and vice versa. And so in many ways, we are a global reality. And I think if this pandemic has not shown us that, then we missed the point. Because I think what we finally understand is what happens in one part of our world is happening everywhere, and it is our social responsibility to be active and involved. Follow your heart, but take your brain with you. So you can see also Adler's humor. I mean, he was a very interesting person because he said things in very, he thought, simple language, but yet to think about what that means, follow your heart, but take your brain with you. So in many ways, what he was saying is we have many emotions, we have many feelings, and we have our cognition. And our cognition must work in relation and always in connection with in a holism. It is always easier to fight for one's principles than to live up to them. And I think all of us know that if we're attempting to live up to the concept of social interest, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, that is a very high level to aspire to. And so I always believe that we are always in movement towards and away, and that we are always busy at working as Adlerians to figure out how to live our principles more fully, how to feel engaged and have the ability to kind of give it away. So my belief has always been, as a faculty member, a teacher, a facilitator, a therapist, whatever I learn, I have responsibility to give it away, to make sure that it's going out into the world. It's just not my personal piece to work with. It is mine to give away. It is mine to model. It is mine to work with. And I think that's true of all of you who have come online today, that in some ways we're the generation now that have the social responsibility to take action based on Alfred Adler and Rudolf Dreikurs principles. By changing our opinion of ourselves, we also change ourselves. So I think that many of us have many mistaken convictions, as we call them, and sometimes we hold on and stay connected to beliefs and feelings and thoughts that are not in our best interest. And I think Adler was a wonderful role model. If you look at the way his world was, he began as a young child, having great difficulty moving. He had a lot of illness. His body was not in any way healthy. He was run over and hit in 2 traffic accidents before the age of 6. And so one of his earliest memories, as you may know, was that he was sitting with his legs in bandages on a bench where he was watching the other children play. And he understood that that was not something he could do, but he wanted to be part of it. He wanted to experience it. He wanted to still be the social being that he had come into the world to be. And that influenced him greatly. It played a role, because he also had many hospitalizations. It played a role in his decision to become a physician. Because what he believed is that I have a responsibility not only for myself, but to make the world a better place than maybe I have experienced because of my story. And I also am always working in intergenerational change. So I must, I often feel in awe of the challenges, the pressures, the personal struggles that both Rudolf Dreikurs and Alfred Adler had to live through in their own stories in order to create the theory and the practice and the ability to write the material to help us to learn to move it forward and move it forward and move it forward. They may be my enemies, that I cannot help, but I will not be theirs. And many of you probably know that Adler kind of went through 3 stages in his theory. So the first stage in his theory was, working as a medical doctor, being very concerned about what was happening in Vienna to the circus people, to the artists. He worked with some of the ballerinas who at that point were not validated as we do today. And so in many ways, he, from a very young age, had decided to work with people who really were not having accessibility to services. And I think if I think about today, we're living in a world in the same story. There are many, many people that the pandemic has shown us are not accessing the kind of supports or services that they have the right to. And we're learning and looking at the poverty that is so evident in all our countries, and that it is not true that everyone has the same rights and the same ability to access what they need. And so both Rudolf Dreikurs and Alfred Adler were role models of going to the people and being with the people as a whole. That they were not representing a government. They were not representing a certain line in the sand that said, this is the way you must think. This is the way you must believe. This is the way you must be. He believed that we were to walk beside people. We were to facilitate. We were to role model, but also we were to take away some of the blocks and the kind of social challenges. So he worked on poverty. He worked on women's rights. He worked on making sure that the tailors who had terrible working conditions in Vienna, that they would fight in the streets to get the rights to have what they needed in order to have a basic life and have rights to what every human being on this planet deserves. And so, my understanding of how Adler moved in life as he became much more active in the community is that he felt that it was not his job to build a theory that people would not understand, and it would only be exclusively available to a certain part of the population. He believed that his theory and his practice was to be done inside the communities, with the communities, and at an economic reality that people could access services. And so he and Dreikurs worked with him, set up the child guidance clinics, where he understood that if we bring families together, they have the ability to learn from each other. And so he would work at the front of the room with one family, and these events were sold out in Vienna. He often had hundreds of families available at these evening presentations because they were looking for education. They were looking for resources, and his job, he always felt, was to give what he had away. It was not to hide it. It was not to hold on to it as someone above. He wanted to, in fact, I think at one point he said, I am one of the people. And so I think it tells us as Adlerian therapists and educators and personal growth and development that we need to be cognizant at this time in history that if we're going to walk with Adler and in his memory and in his theory, that we have the responsibility to become change agents. We have the responsibility to take social action. We have the responsibility to be highly cognitive right now at whom are the people that do not have full rights to the society that they live in. And I think that's what's appealed to me all these years of staying with Adler, because I was trained also as a social worker, and social work is done very much in the community and in the trenches of what's happening in the world. So as I was moving towards this presentation, I created a question that I'm going to now, can you see it? Is there a way of seeing this, Sabina? Okay, does everyone see the question? Okay. So I sent this question out to a number of people in various countries just to see, in answering this question, or what we would believe. And by the way, I want any of you to do this while I read it. I just want you to think about the answer to this question. If you were to meet Alfred Adler today and ask for his advice for navigating this particular moment in history together, what Adlerian principles do you believe he would recommend to Adlerians around the world to practice and teach at this time? And just take a moment and think about all the principles that you've learned, that you're working with, that you live by. And think about, at this time in history, what would be, and they don't have to be more than one or two, what are two principles that you feel would be important to practice and teach at this time as Adlerians? Now, I don't know, Sabina, if people can they write and send them to you? Is that how it works? Or they can just...
They can put it in the chat. I hope everybody has the chat enabled, and people do that. So, yeah.
Okay, so if you want to just share it, and then I'm going to share what the people whom I connected with sent back to me in a graph, and then maybe we'll add, Sabina, a few more of what people came from the audience with. Is that okay? Okay. So I think there were probably about 20 people around the world, and I tried to find people in each country or various countries to answer this question, and I invited some faculty, I invited some participants in ICASSI, I invited some people in my area who are teachers and role models of Adler. And so if you look at the inner circle, this is where most of the majority of people felt were the most important concepts right now that we have to live by. And social interest was very, very high in terms of numbers, and was also with social equality. Now, I put community feeling in as well because, you know, Adler in his writings wrote much earlier about community feeling, and then later in his writings wrote about social interest. And I find that fascinating because community feeling is very similar to social interest, and it is probably the prime piece that we all need to be working on. But I guess equality comes with that. And so these were the other ideas that people added. They said that mutual respect was very important. The love task was incredibly important. The rights and responsibilities of people, courage, goal-directed movement, encouragement, action, optimism, cooperation, hope, belonging, empathy, the 4 C's. So that's what came out of the experiment. It was kind of just sending it out and getting people to add. I don't know, Sabina, if anyone has added yet to the chart.
Yeah, we have quite a lot of people putting in their thoughts in the chat. A lot are the same that your people said. So Gemeinschaftsgefühl, social interest, community feeling, solidarity, holism, cooperation, empathy, the perspective of others, encouragement, contribution, social embeddedness, and social engagement, and the feeling of belonging.
Great. So it doesn't surprise me we're all on the same page, but if you look at this chart, imagine if everyone that walked this earth believed in these concepts, we're actualizing these concepts, we're actually reaching out to have these concepts, because I think that's what Adler would say. He would say, people are reaching out. They are wanting to belong, and that we have more in common as human beings than we have differences. But the difficulty that we do is we often talk about people as different. And that's why when we talk about different cultures and different genders, right, and different socioeconomics and different. And Adler always said that we have more in common than we have differences. And that's where we needed to put our connections and spend our time in creating social equality for all. So as you can tell, Adler and Dreikurs were both optimists. I mean, they actually believed, even though look at what people are attempting to do, create a world based on cooperation, on community feeling, on empathy, on love, on goal-directedness. Like, this is a major task we've taken on. But yet, for me, it's just exciting that we could send messages around the world and say, So what are your thoughts about this, and what principles do you think would be best in terms of this time in history? And the commonality was incredibly strong. And it's exactly what Sabina, the people also adding from the session today, are reinforcing. So I think we have our roadmap as Adlerians. These are the things that if we're living as well as we can with these pieces of theory and practice and modeling and the ownership of them, I think the world will continue to make progress. You know, I'm going to talk to you about a book that I'm reading called Humankind in a moment. But what this man Bregman says, and he's actually from the Netherlands, Theo, I don't know if you know his work, but he absolutely believes that people are much more oriented around the world to social interest, community feeling, connection than anything else. And so I'm going to raise his concept because he's a historian and he's looked at history for the last 200,000 years. And he's looking at what are the commonalities as you go through. And he's saying they come very much in alignment with Adler and Dreikurs in terms of what they were saying. So I wanted to talk a minute about courage, social interest, and responsibility. Adler is experienced through the war years and the pandemic, because you have to remember that, you know, there was a pandemic following the war. So I think the pandemic was 1918 to 1920 maybe. And Adler was very active in that work in his medical field after the war. And so in some ways, history is repeating itself 100 years later for different reasons, that we are now once again experiencing a human condition that is traveling all around our globe. So it changed him. The war changed him. The beliefs about what he was standing on changed him. And out of that came his beliefs around community feeling, social interest, and that direction of being a global citizen. Now, Adler was always oriented to be a global citizen, but he actually, in his writings after 1920, really it was all about, we really have to kind of change the social embeddedness that people are living, and we have to become, you know, much more committed to a world that has social equality and social justice. Because he saw the reality of warfare, death, and destruction, and the misuse of power and its devastating effect on the well-being of humankind. I must say, if I think about today, he would be probably saying this to us as well, that we have to have the courage, we have to be socially engaged, and we have to take the responsibility as Adlerians to move this reality forward to make sure we learn from this pandemic. And what are we going to learn, and how is it going to change the social fabric of our world? He spoke not only of the illogic of war and conflict, but established a psychology that reflected a worldview of cooperation and collaborative nonviolent problem solving. He called for courage and risk-taking and personal responsibility for individuals to be willing to contribute to making a non-violent cooperative world. A quote, "People always make mistakes if they do not see that their whole significance must consist in their contribution to the lives of others." And so he was a pretty wise, model for all of us in terms of his vision of where we needed to be. To look more specifically at the concept of social interest, one sees in Adler's later writings that social interest was associated, is it okay, Sabina? Or? Okay. Later writings that social interest was associated with activity and cooperation. Social interest was presented as an activating, guiding behavior in a direction towards one's fellow men on the socially useful side of life. I really actually like that quote. I mean, to be more specifically at to look at social interest, we're looking at later writings, and he always associated social interest with activity, which means you've got to be out there. You have to be naming the social ills or the social needs or the inequities that we're living. We have to create equality for all people. So social interest was very much an activating, guiding behavior in a direction that included all of us in that responsibility on the useful side of life. Alfred Adler stated, "It is the individual who is not interested in his fellow men who has the greatest difficulties in life and provides the greatest injury to others. It is from among such individuals that all human failure springs." And so in some ways at that level, I think he was talking about people who own the power and people who actually may be incredibly discouraged human beings, but they're in a position of power and therefore are not practicing and are not really connecting to social interest. And I would say, as I look around the world at this moment in time, you know, we have many examples of leadership that just are not leading, right? And I think Alfred Adler hoped that the leaders 100 years later would be developed further potentially than we are and practicing much more social interest in each of our countries. But the job is not done. For Adler, a meaningful community exists only within an environment of social equality. He encouraged political and social activism and for individuals to take responsibility for their broader community and ultimately the world. So I want to change now just to talk about Rutger Bregman, who actually lives in, as I understand, he lives in Amsterdam. And he is a historian, a Dutch historian, who is a provocative contemporary thinker. And I often think that it would be fun if Adler and Dreikurs had an ability to chat with this man, because they have a lot in common. So in a new book, he reflects on the past 200,000 years of human history and postulates that we are human beings that are hardwired for kindness. We are geared towards cooperation rather than competition and are more inclined to trust than distrust others. Powerful statement. He argues that believing in human generosity and collaboration isn't merely optimism, it's realism, or it's realistic that we could actually move society in that direction. When we think the worst of people, it brings out the worst in our politics and our economics. But if we believe in the reality of humanity, which is kindness and altruism, it will form the foundation for achieving true change. So one of the things he talks about is courage. And this is actually what Adler and Dreikurs said about courage. What is courage? Courage is the willingness to risk failure. There is only one danger, this is what Adler said, I find in life, and that indeed is a real one. You may take too many precautions. Overcoming difficulties leads to courage, self-respect, and knowing yourself. So once again, I think this is a time in history where we are called to have courage, to live with courage, to feel courageous in our understanding of the world, others, and what needs to happen to get us beyond a time that is causing so much pain for so many people. So I guess in conclusion, for me, life means to contribute to the whole. What I see where we are now is we are the stepping stones for the present and the future. So whatever we do, and you all know at ICASSI, I teach intergenerational patterns. So I am very conscious that what ripples behind us and what is going to become our forward are the stepping stones, and the middle is where we are. We are those stepping stones. We are the people following in the footsteps of other people from other times. So Bregman actually, you know, this is an Adler quote, but it could be Bregman's, if not me, then who? We stand on the shoulders of those who have modeled the Adlerian way. Whose footsteps are you walking in? Who are your encouragers? Who are your role models? Because I believe that if we are really going to honor the legacy of Adler's vision, his theory, and his tremendous investment in believing that he was positioned in the world at the time he was positioned in the world to make it a better place, not only for himself, not only for his family, and not only for Vienna. He said, my responsibility is to the world. And so I don't think as Adlerians we are, what's the right word? I think we're quiet. It's not always that our voices are heard or that we're in that political position. And in Bregman's book, he talks about that one of the things we have to be very, very careful of, because he's done a lot of research, that when people are in distress or people are going through difficult times, they do not turn away from each other. They actually turn towards each other. So he studied the 9/11 attacks in America, and he discovered that the people who were in the towers and were walking down the stairs to get out, they even stopped each time a helper came by and had someone who was worse off. They would step aside and let him or her take this person and wait. He also looked at when the New Orleans flooding happened in the United States, many people had no place to live and they were all housed in a big auditorium. And the news kept talking about all the looting and all the problems. And actually, when it was studied afterwards, there was more social interest. There was more supporting. There was, in other words, I think sometimes we know the story in World War II, where the soldiers stopped at midnight on Christmas Eve. They stopped the war. They said, we're going to have peace for overnight. And they sang caroling, and one soldier exchanged a gift with another soldier, on the opposite side. So we have great capacity as Adlerians to live social interests that, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, the communal feeling. And I guess my question for all of us is, if it's not me, then who? Because we stand on the role models, and you've all had many of the same role models I had. Eva Dreikurs Ferguson, of course, is there as one of mine, and Edna Nash and Oscar Christensen, and so many of you that are on the faculty. And so I think this is an amazing time for Adlerians. It's kind of like a call to action, and we're all doing our part. But I also think that we also have to be a voice that is a little more kind of naming the inequities and naming what needs to be different in order for us to make progress. So if you want to think for a minute, just who are those encouragers and who are those role models and whose footsteps are you walking in? Because I must say, I feel the role models that were my teachers have taught me that it's never over. Many people ask me if I'll ever retire, and this is my 50th year of working as a therapist, and someone asked me, like, are you ever going to retire? And I say, well, all the people that were my early teachers in the psychology that I work in were all at least in their 60s or 70s or 80s when I was learning from them. So they taught me that I have no ability to retire if I'm going to be an Adlerian. I just have to keep doing and being. And I think that was Adler's message. I think it was very much Ansbacher's message, who lived till 103. I think that we have great role models, and of course Eva, who's a wonderful role model for all of us. And I think we've been gifted. I have to tell you that I believe that we have been gifted if we found Adlerian psychology, because I was trained in other psychiatry before I came to Adler. And I feel we have been given a gift. It's a harder gift sometimes than other gifts, because it's never over. And what we have to contribute is never, probably ever enough. But I think if we watch the people who've gone before us and we realize we're role modeling now for the next generations, that we have our responsibility to practice, to be our socially interested, community-based, reality-based, and the courage to name, to be, and to get through these difficult times and tell a story of how people were kind and people were joined, and that we truly are social beings in a very significant way in that we understand the art of encouragement, and we understand strengths-based therapy. And we understand that coming together means we are definitely more influential than standing alone. So thank you. It's been a joy to be part of the opening of our first virtual ICASSI, and I hope that, you know, there's been something that just verifies and validates what you're already doing, because I think we, as in the Adlerian world and in the ICASSI world, constantly are making deposits, and we deposit and we deposit and we deposit. And I think we just keep depositing, and then the outcomes are shown much later than just today. So thank you, Theo, Eva, and ICASSI for allowing me to be part of the opening.